Thank you for listening to this sermon from Valley Life Church. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to our website at valleylife.church, or better yet, come be our guest on a Sunday morning.
I'm really glad you're here. We're sold out today. If somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, scoot over, we need some seat, then please accommodate that. I'm glad to see everyone is here for our First Things First sermon series. We do it every January, and some people are saying, we've gone through 40-something chapters of Isaiah in 2024. Are we going to finish the book? And we will finish the book. We take a little break in January to cover the first things, to set the stage for who we want to be as a church. What are the seeds that sprout up into a healthy church? And to begin with, last week we talked about the context. What's going on in our culture, in our country, and in our community that we're trying to minister in. And I encourage you to go back and listen to that sermon. If you're new here and you want to find out what Valley Life is all about, you can go back and see last week what we think is the culture that we're ministering in. And then today, we talk about what is the gospel. Next week, we'll do what do Christians do? What are the activities Christians involve themselves in? And then how do Christians conceive of themselves? What do we think of us? What do Christians think of Christians? And then we'll do the week number 5 is one of my favorite weeks every time we do this. What is baptism, Lord's Supper, and church membership for? What's it for? So that is our First Things First series. And today, again, what is the gospel? When I first started thinking about what is the gospel, I had someone discipling me and mentoring me about 15 years ago. And there's this little phrase that has helped me so much. I want to make sure you know it, okay? If you were like, you had to leave, you got a text, and I got to go, but I need a real quick thing of what was the sermon going to be about? Here it is, okay? The gospel, we'll talk about what it is, but the gospel is not just the ABCs of the Christian life. If you're teaching a little kid, you start off with the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s, if they're little. And then you think, well, when they get older, they'll learn to read and they can get into literature and it'll grow and grow and grow. And that is not the gospel. The gospel is not the ABCs. The guy told me the gospel is the A through Z. Everything you need for life as a Christian, everything you need for a church member at Valley Life, it's in this gospel, okay? That means whatever situation you find yourself in, the answer to it is this thing that's the gospel. So there's a lot of different ways to apply it. Let me just do 3 as an introduction. Let's talk about romance, friendships, and church. Your relationship in romance, your relationships in friendships, and your relationship to the church and as the church. Number 1, love and marriage. Next week, I get on a plane, I fly to Oklahoma, and there's a church there that has invited me, your pastor, to come to a marriage conference because they think that I can do that. And I get the irony. It's ironic that I'll talk for 4 different sessions at this big conference retreat center to a group of people about here's how to do a Christian marriage. In between breakfast and lunch, I get 4 talks and I'll straighten everybody out just like that. While at the same time, back on the ranch at Phoenix at Valley Life Church, so many of our marriages are choking on the smell of hell. I get the irony that so many of our married men are walking around with no self-control and making every evil thing that happens in their family way worse. And married women of Valley Life Church are living with this uninvestigated, uninterrogated love for the things of the world. These women are setting fires to every good thing Jesus has given them and daring anyone to come and put them out. And I want to convince you, if you are not yet married, and we have a lot of young adult singles that come here, I want to speak to young adult singles. Can I beg? Do pastors beg? I think when a pastor begs, it's called pleading. I'll plead with you to walk away from someone you love who does not love Christ. You're going to save yourself so much trouble. And I'll plead with you to please let me convince the married people in this room, no matter how long you've been married, you're young married, old married, I've learned that it doesn't matter how long you've been married. I plead with you to abandon the idea, the notion that you can do better through adultery or divorce or good old-fashioned bitter unforgiveness. I plead with you. And I'm saying that the gospel is not the ABCs. I'll confess my sins, I'll believe in Christ, they'll baptize me, and then I got to figure out marriage on my own. Or maybe there's some stuff in the Bible about marriage. And I'm telling you, it is the gospel. That's the answer. It's not ABC. It's the A through Z. It's not the diving board that gets you into Christianity. It's the whole pool that you'll swim in every category of life, starting with marriage and romance, even friends. You know, Proverbs 13:20 says, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. I love seeing the kids in here. They can understand this. If you walk with wise people at school, you yourself will become wise. And if you surround yourself with companions who are foolish, you'll become a fool. So let me convince you. And when I preach about the gospel from 1 Corinthians 15 today, and then Numbers 21, that's about the gospel. Let me plead and beg with you that please stop walking with foolish friends. Let me convince you that being friends with someone about anything other than Jesus Christ will lead you to suffer harm. Be friends about Jesus and then with the church. If we had to start again from scratch, or maybe you moved to some place and there is no church. Let's say you moved somewhere, there is no church there, and you had to start with just you and your family. Where would you start? You would start with the gospel. In the gospel is like the heirloom seed of everything that you would need to make a church, a godly people, and to do everything. The understanding of humanity, the understanding of sexuality and family and work and how to have joy, it's all right there in this notion of the gospel, the good news of Christ. So let me convince you. If you'll let me, can I convince you through this sermon to conceptualize your relationship to the church, not as a consumer to a product, but as a body part to the entire body. You can get that by understanding, incorporating, and using the gospel of Jesus Christ in all of these categories of life. And if you're suspicious, you might think this. I know your angle, Pastor. I mean, after all, you're a pastor of a church, and you just want all the people in the church to live as holy as lives as possible, as though we're already in heaven, even at the threat of my happiness. And I would say, guilty as charged. That's exactly what I want. I want you to live as holy as lives as possible, as though we are already in heaven, even at the threat of your temporary happiness, because the rains are coming. The storms are coming. You've heard me say it all the time. You're either in a storm, coming out of a storm, or headed for another storm. Where did I get that? Well, my dad told that to me, but it's based in what Jesus said. Jesus says in Matthew 7, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rains fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. I'm asking you, pleading with you in front of everybody, build your house on the good news of Jesus Christ. So what is it? What is this gospel? Well, one way of saying it, there's a lot of great ways of saying it. Here's one. Jesus in my place for my sins. I'm the sinner. I've got these sins, and I will stand before God and be judged for my sins. I'm building my house on something, church and romance and my identity as a man, your identity as a woman. We're building all of this on something. And Jesus said, if you hear these words of mine and you don't incorporate this and build your life on it, you're building your house on something else. And everything else is sand. And that would be fine if it weren't for the fact that the rains come and the floods come and the wind comes and beat on the house and it fell. Great was the fall of it. This is the most important thing we can learn. What is the gospel? And I've said it's Jesus in my place for my sin. That's a summary of what we're going to read today in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I want to show you this, okay? This is a nice little Bible timeline that I found recently. And it shows you, like we've been studying Isaiah, right? We've been studying Isaiah, and in Isaiah, it basically encompasses, let's see, basically encompasses this part here. Really more like this part here, all right? This is the creation of the world. There's Adam and Eve. You get Noah's flood. And God calls Abraham. We've done this before. God calls Abraham and says, from your family, I'm going to make a mighty nation. But the family of Abraham gets enslaved by Egypt there for a while. And God told Moses to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And there you get the Exodus right there, okay? As they left Egypt, they enter into the promised land. God gives them kings. And we've talked about this part right here where the kingdom gets divided. This was all in Isaiah, and we did it all in 2024. You get the southern kingdom, Judah, that timeline, and the northern kingdom here, and it stops because Assyria comes in. This is all review, right? Assyria comes in, and the people are in exile to Assyria. The southern kingdom continues on into Babylon, and this is when Isaiah is prophesying through here. And you get 400 years of silence, and then here it is, Jesus' death and resurrection. That's why the cross is right there. After Jesus' death and resurrection, you get the age of the church. Now, what we're reading about today is a departure from Isaiah, which happened back here 800 years before Jesus' death and resurrection and the formation of the people of God, who we call the church, all the churches that sprang up because of that. Now, this letter that we're reading right now is a letter from Paul to one of those churches. And we're going to start in chapter 15, verse 1, where he says, to Christians and to a church, he says, now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel. I would remind you. Why is he reminding? This is very important. Every person in here, including the ones on the platform, need to be reminded of this good news, because it's not ABC. It's not something you move on from. It's not a diving board that you leap from and then enter into something else. It's everything you need for every category in your life. I would remind you to recall to one's mind as though what has been made known has escaped him. That's what the word is. I'm going to try to get you to think of something that you have probably forgotten. What is that thing that you've probably forgotten that he says to Corinthians? The gospel. This is why community groups are so important. This is why I'm just begging you, if you haven't got into one of those groups, go out there and sign up for a group, because we need that daily reminder. We need that regular reminder, and we can put something on your calendar that happens every week or every 2 weeks so that you know I'm going to get the reminder from other people, because whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, and the companion of fools will suffer harm. You've heard me say before, God is not afraid to hurt you, but he will not harm you. A lot of the stuff God allows and does hurts. It doesn't harm. It's the companion of fools that suffers harm. So he says, I'll remind you, and then he says, brothers. That's an interesting word. He's saying to the brotherhood, to the Christians. This gospel is the way that if you're here and you're not a Christian, you can become a Christian because of the good news. But most of you here would say, I already am a Christian. And Paul would say, yeah, you. Let me remind you of the gospel, that the gospel is for Christians. Preaching is for Christians. The Bible, it's for Christians. It's for the people of God. And now the word gospel. I would remind you of the gospel. What is the gospel? How do we use the word gospel in common vernacular? As I thought about that, I remembered that people say sometimes, you're saying that thing like it's the gospel truth. It sort of implies that the word gospel kind of also means the truth. Now, I want to tell you, the gospel is true, but the gospel, that word, doesn't basically mean the truth. It basically means something that's good. It basically means good news. The English word gospel is two old English words that get mashed together the way, sometimes we make contractions out of stuff. Is not becomes isn't it or ain't. But this word, it's good news, got mashed together, and now it said gospel. It's something that's good that you didn't know and that you didn't make. It's not advice. There's nothing you can do about the gospel. It's something that happened. And in fact, it happened right there. Jesus' death and resurrection. It happened. You don't need to do anything about it. It has already occurred. If you want to live a good life and you want to have a good way about you, you need a lot of good advice. And I'm not down on advice. I like getting advice. I was trying to eat healthy a few years ago. I'm at Arby's. I texted my trainer who owns a gym. I texted him and I said, hey, I'm at Arby's. what can I get here that will help me meet my goals? And he wrote back, the napkins. Yeah, that's good advice. That's not very good news. Good news is like, I've got this trouble in my body. Everybody's told me it's cancer, but I go back and the scan says it's gone. There's nothing for you to do. It's just good news. Gospel means good news. If you want to live a better life before you die, you need some good advice. If you want to live with God after you die, you're going to need some good news. And he says, I preached this gospel to you. That's the second half of that verse. I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand. The gospel is to be told, not sold. I'm not selling you on something. This has already occurred. Some of you believe it and build your life on it, and some of you do not. I'm not selling, I'm telling. This has occurred. Jesus died in my place for my sins. And then he says, you received it. And the way I said this, the way I wrote it in my notes, is the gospel is to be received, not just agreed. You can agree that this occurred. You can read some history books and listen to some podcasts and get the verifiable evidence that this occurred. But that's not the same as receiving it as your own. After the first service, a guy came and talked to me, and he said, I want to believe, I do believe that these things happen, but it's really difficult to ask him to be the Lord of my life. He said, it's kind of like letting a stranger in your home. I said, it's exactly like that. And then you give him the deed and you say, you can run this better than I can. If that hasn't happened to you, you may have agreed with the gospel. It's different to receive it. And then Paul addresses those, he says, who stand in it, right? Isn't that what he says? In which you stand. You stand in the gospel. You live your life in the pool of the gospel. This is the way you understand everything about you. So I said, Paul addresses those who stand in it, not just those who understand it. One of my great fears as a 50-year-old man who pastors a church is that I would preach to people who agree and understand and have not received or stood in the gospel. And it would make sense. You would see it. You would see that there is I think we would call it an assent, a head nod, and an agreement that doesn't change their life. You can see it in their romances. It's patently obvious. You can see it in their friendships and who they are drawn to and who they give their relationship to. You can see it in their relationship to the church as a consumer good and a consumer. It's patently obvious, it's true if you have understood it, but not standing in it. And he doesn't want that. He says, I preach this to you, and you received it, in which you stand. And then in verse 2, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word that I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. So this part of the sermon is where I ask you to open up a file in the hard drive of your mind, and you can tag it believing in vain. And a lot of the things that you see going on in churches or in your church or in your circle of relationships, you can drop those things in that file and say, there is such a thing as believing in vain. There is a vain belief. And as I studied that, that's an important phrase for a preacher who leads a church. That Paul says that there's a category like that. And I had to look at that word, and that word means without due consideration. But you didn't really think about how it's giving Jesus the deed to your life, inviting this stranger in to come and run relationships for you, to believe in a haphazard manner, to believe thoughtlessly or at random. That's what the word in vain means. And for you community group leaders, I'd like for you to take this note and use this in your community groups this week, because I don't have time to get into it. It's Mark chapter 4, verses 14 through 20. In that place, Jesus tells a parable that explains really well how it is that somebody can believe and receive this gospel in a way that ends up with vanity and no change in their life. I'm going to move on to verse 3. He says, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So he says, I got this from someone else. Paul says, I received this, I heard it, and I'm telling you about it. And he tells this Corinthian church about it and the other churches, and they pass it on to other churches who pass it on to other churches. And now here we sit in Phoenix, Arizona, 2,000 years later, and I'm passing it along to you. So now you're going to know today basically what is the gospel. He says, I delivered to you as of first importance, the first things first, what I received. And here it is, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That part, in accordance with the Scriptures, is in reference to that back here, when Isaiah was writing and when Jeremiah was writing, that they are predicting that someone is going to come and make a final sacrifice. That all of the Old Testament animal sacrifices are going to come to an end when the perfect sacrifice is made. All of that was predicted in your Bible 800 years before it ever happened. And it's in Isaiah chapter 53. In our study of Isaiah, we haven't got there yet, but we're going to get there, where it says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Predicted before it ever happened. And then verse 4, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So Jesus' crucifixion was written about in Isaiah, and he says Jesus' resurrection was written about in the Old Testament as well. In Psalm 16:10 it says, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or to the grave. You'll not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. And Paul says, see, in the Psalms it talks about the resurrection. All of this was God's plan ahead of time, that Jesus died in my place for my sins, and that's always been the plan. And then after he resurrected, maybe you didn't know this part, it's an important part of the gospel, is that he appeared to people. In verse 5, it says that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, that's Peter. He appeared to Peter and then to the other apostles. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. It's important that you know, Jesus died on a cross for sins he did not do. He resurrected, showing us he has power over death. We all have to die physically, but Jesus has the power over death so that you can live again. And then he walked around for a month and a half, for 40 days, and he's doing things like eating breakfast, seeing his friends, showing, he said to Thomas, you can put your finger in the holes in my hands where they crucified me, and put your arm into my side where they pierced my side. This is, in his case, verifiable. Jesus didn't just leave and say, believe it, I'm not showing you. He stayed around for 40 days. And then this week, on the most famous podcast in the world, the Joe Rogan podcast, a Christian man got on there and pointed to this passage. When Rogan, asking about Christianity, said, yeah, but did anybody see the resurrection? And this guy, his name's Wesley Huff, he said, yeah, in 1 Corinthians 15, it says more than 500 people saw him at one time. And he points out that Paul is talking about something that only happened 20 years ago in his time. Now, it's hard to think about, but that for us, that would be 2005. What happened in 2005? In 2005, YouTube was launched. They've done pretty well since. YouTube was launched in 2005, and if you said, hey, YouTube was launched just 20 years ago, someone said, that's really hard to believe. You would say, well, it was only 20 years ago. There's a lot of people that saw it happen. Some have died, some are fallen asleep, but just ask around, some people saw that thing get launched. And that's exactly what Paul is saying. Jesus resurrected from the grave. It was about 20 years ago for him. He said, there's people that saw it. Some have died, some have fallen asleep, but most of them are still alive, and you can ask around. So, that is the gospel. Jesus in our place for our sins, as predicted by the Bible. How does that apply to you? And maybe also, how does that apply to that story that Keely read to us from Numbers 21? In Numbers 21, it says, back here, during the Exodus, before they got to the promised land, that they're in the wilderness. The people of God, being led by Moses, are walking around. And when they ran out of food, God provided, through a miracle, food on the ground. They got this bread called manna, and you could pick it up every day. God gave them their daily bread, like Jesus taught us to pray. Every day it was out there, just as a miracle of God's provision. And it says, from Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and Moses. They said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Okay, so first point, they say there's no food except the food that you gave us. There's nothing to eat here except the stuff that you gave us to eat. But we loathe this worthless food. When I was a kid, I remember telling Mom, I'm hungry. I want something to eat. And she would say, we have this. And I would say, I'm not hungry for that. I'm hungry for Laffy Taffies or whatever it was. This is why I tell you all the time, never justify your lack of joy. Never justify becoming impatient on the way. Never justify that feeling where I'm hungry for something and God says, here's something. He says, I'm not hungry for that. I'm hungry for food that you do not give me. Never justify your lack of joy. When you become discontent, when you feel bitterness creep up in your heart, when you start becoming hungry for that which God does not give, that should be like a light on the dashboard that says, pull over, something's wrong. You can't go on in this way. You will suffer harm. Then the Lord, verse 6, sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many people of Israel died. Fiery serpents, I think we can do this pretty easy. These fiery serpents still exist today in the Middle East, and there are some here in Phoenix and in Arizona. They're just these poisonous snakes. We all know about poisonous snakes. And when they bite, the feeling is like fire, and that fire becomes inflammation that will swell up your ankle, and that poison goes through your body. And these fiery serpents would kill people, and God sent them because the people of God were discontent and wanted food that God did not provide. And then the biggest miracle, maybe of the whole story, is in verse 7. When Keely read it, you saw a miracle at the end of the story, but I see a miracle in verse 7. The people came to Moses and said, we have sinned. In my time of pastoring, it just doesn't happen like that very often. That ain't the way it goes, usually. I look inside of some of your lives where you're suffering harm, wanting food that God does not give. And your discontentment, your lack of joy, you're reaching your hand out for things that God did not prescribe for you and has forbidden from you. And it bites. And it's obvious to everyone in your romances, in your friendships, in your relationship to God's people, that it bites and it kills. And when you feel that poison creeping up your leg and starts to destroy everything, not so very often do people say, oh, that was sinful. We need to repent. We have sinned, for we've spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away these serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. What gets in the way of it happening from one verse to another? In our life, why doesn't it happen one after the other so quickly like that? And the answer is pride. It's exactly what it is. We're set on a way. And it takes humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God that he would forgive us and lift us up. And that's what happens here. Moses prays for the people. And in verse 8, the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, and he set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. Have you been bitten by sin? Do you feel its sting, its fiery bite, the swelling spreading through your entire life? Paul said that the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Moses was told by God, make a bronze serpent, which is a weird, that's an odd thing to do. The thing that's killing everybody, make a sort of a statue out of it. Put it up on a pole in the middle of the camp where everybody can see it. And if you've been bitten by sin and it starts to ruin everything, it starts to kill people, just look up at the pole. It would be like if there was a mountain lion up on the mountain behind the church. And that sucker always kept coming down here and getting the kids. And we were like, man, we can't have this. Ricky, you got to go get the mountain lion. Somebody do something about it. We need one of our man's men to go up there and get that thing. And we send one of those, maybe it's Lucas. Lucas wears boots. We send him up there, get a weapon and go up there and get that thing. And he comes back and goes, I took care of it. Everything's fine now. We say, how do we know you took care of it? And he goes, I'll show you. Takes the head of the mountain lion, sticks it on a pole, and sets it up and said, it's dead. It's done. It is finished. And Jesus tells Nicodemus in John chapter 3, in the same way, Moses took the serpent and set it on a pole, and anyone who would look to it would live. He said, I will be crucified and lifted up. And he who knew no sin becomes sin, lifted up in a crucifixion for everyone to see. And if anyone will simply look to him, you can't save yourself. You can't do anything about the gospel, but you can believe it. You can look to him. And if we would only look, we'll be forgiven. So if you follow this argument that I'm making today, you would conclude that if married people are in disunity, you need the gospel. That the answer to the problem is looking to Christ, because looking away from Christ is what created the problem. The reason looking to him is the answer is because looking away from him was the problem. Look to Christ. If you follow the argument that the single people who are falling for the sons and daughters of Satan need the gospel, they need to look to Christ. And all the sins of this world have been crucified and lifted up. And if we will only look to him, we'll be forgiven and set free from the bite and the sting of sin. If you follow the argument, then if our church members are selfish or bitter or unforgiving or worldly, they need the good news of Jesus Christ. Let me convince you, unmarried people, to walk away from someone you love that does not love Christ because you're hungry for food that God does not give. Let me convince you, married people, to abandon the idea that you can do better through adultery or divorce or just plain bitter unforgiveness, because you've been poisoned by a demon that wants your marriage and family destroyed. And if you look to Christ, you'll be forgiven. Let me convince you that being friends with people about anything other than Jesus Christ, that it's the bite. That is the bite. And you've been poisoned, and it will make you foolish, and you will suffer harm. Save yourselves. Save yourselves and look to Christ. Look to him who did not save himself from death, but was willing to be lifted up on a cursed pole for everyone to see, to save anyone who would simply look to him. He will not give you bad gifts. He will give you good gifts. Humble yourselves and look to Christ.
Hi, it's Pastor Brian, and I hope this sermon is helping you become good, glad, and strong in your faith. But remember, there's just nothing like being a part of your own local church. So if you're in the North Phoenix area, you should join us this Sunday. And if you do, make sure you find me and say hello. And if you're not in North Phoenix, our team would consider it a real honor to help get you connected to a church near you. Just email us at hello@valleylife.church, and we'll do our very best to help you out. Now, you can always find more podcasts, community groups, service opportunities, and even a giving link on our app and on our website. Press on.